Today we think of a patriot as a supporter of the government, but in the 18th century, it usually meant someone who loved his or her country, and there's some very, very important female patriots. I'd be happy to talk about them during the Q&A. Female patriotism is definitely a thing in the 18th century. So it usually meant someone who loved his or her country but opposed its government.
And the purpose of this year's lecture series is to take an in-depth look at the effect of the Townsend Acts, which were a series of tax measures passed by British Parliament in 1767 in Boston and America, and why they provoked so much opposition. And tonight we're going to go a little farther afield to look at some of the international implications of the Townsend Acts. Our speaker tonight is Elijah Gould, who is a professor of history at the University of New Hampshire, and he's also chair of the history department there. Elijah received his bachelor's degree from Princeton University, an MSc from University of Edinburgh, and then his MA and PhD from Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. His most recent book is Among the Powers of the Earth, The American Revolution and the Making of a New World Empire. This was named a Library Journal Best Book of the Year and received the Society for Historians of the Early American Republic Book Prize, and was a finalist for the George Washington Book Prize. Among his other publications are Empire and Nation, The American Revolution in the Atlantic World, which was co-edited with Peter Onuf, The Persistence of Empire, British Political Culture in the Age of the American Revolution, and numerous scholarly articles, book chapters, invited papers, and reviews. He is currently at work on a global history of the peace treaty that ended the American Revolution, Crucible of Peace, the Treaty of Paris, and the founding of the American Republic. Professor Gould has held fellowships from the John Simon Guggenheim Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the Charles Warren Center at Harvard University. The title of his lecture tonight is Tyranny Unmasked, the Townsend Acts in Britain, Ireland, and America. Will you please welcome Elijah Gould.
So this year we have been commemorating the 50th anniversary of one of the most transformative years in American history, 1968, the year that shattered America, in the words of an article from Smithsonian Magazine last January. According to a blurb on the magazine's website, that was the year when, quote, movements that have been building, hang on just a second, I was told I had to turn on my clicker. Okay, I'm good, okay, sorry. 1968, that was the year when movements that had been building along the primary fault lines of the 1960s, the Vietnam War, the Cold War, civil rights, human rights, youth culture, exploded with force. The aftershocks registered both in America and abroad for decades afterward. Among historians, claims about the most important year ever are a lot like claims about the best song or musician or novel or restaurant or quarterback. You're bound to get an argument. I was a boy in 1968, so I've always bridled at the idea that the most important year of my lifetime occurred at a moment when I was effectively barred because of my age from doing anything more than watching it on TV. Never trust anyone over 7. Kidding aside, the Smithsonian blurb reminds us that some years are, in fact, more momentous than others, and that the effects can linger for decades or more. Well, tonight I want to talk about a different, much older year of transformation, the momentous year of 1768. That was the year when political discontent that had been building for years in Britain and throughout its Atlantic empire, the Ireland and America of my title, burst into the open and turned into organized resistance and helped to spawn a new radical consciousness. The details of that resistance varied from place to place. Here in Boston and elsewhere in the colonies, the trigger was the Townsend Acts, the subject of this lecture series. And the dissent was led by radicals known as the Sons of Liberty. And I have up here Samuel Adams, brewer and patriot, also founder of the Sons of Liberty, or one of the founders. In Britain, the protests centered on the dissolute son of a London distiller named John Wilkes. They have alcohol in common, who had fled to France after libeling the king, but had returned in 1768 and got himself elected to Parliament despite being in prison. A neat trick. In Ireland, the trigger was a series of reforms led by the Irish Lord Lieutenant and brother of the Townsend Acts namesake, Charles Townshend. The brother was George Viscount Townshend. And Townsend's principal goal in Ireland was a proposal to increase the Irish army to help with the defense of America, and the leaders of his opposition were dissident Protestants in the Irish House of Commons. No matter where they lived, the radicals of 1768 shared the common label of patriot. I'll say more about that word in a minute. They were united by a common fear of the Parliament of Great Britain and the increasingly tyrannical powers, as they and their supporters saw it, that its members seemed determined to wield in Britain, Ireland, and America. And because they believed they were living in a time when liberty everywhere, including Europe and the rest of the European Atlantic, was under threat, they had a cosmic sense of their own importance. And they didn't quite shatter the British Empire, not in 1768, but they came close. Well, to understand the origins of this moment, I need to say a few words about the Townsend Acts, what they were, and why Parliament enacted them. How many people were here for some of the other talks? Okay. Some of what I'm going to say you probably have heard already, but each lecture should stand on its own. Okay, here we go. They were actually a series of 4 acts passed by Parliament in June of 1767 in succession. I believe they were passed one after another, all of which sought to tighten Britain's control of its American colonies. The focal point, from the colonist standpoint, and probably from Parliament's standpoint as well, was the taxes that the Revenue and Indemnity Acts placed on a basket of imported commodities: lead, paint, glass, paper, and tea. And they're mentioned in the title of this lecture series. That none of these were actually produced by the colonists in the colonies. Instead, they were imported from Britain. The proceeds were to be used to pay the salaries of royal governors and judges in the colonies, who hitherto had been paid by the colonial legislatures, and that was part of the English constitutional practice and the practice here in America as well. The Revenue Act also gave British customs officials much broader rights than they previously had to search private property for smuggled goods. To aid in the taxes enforcement, the Commissioners of Customs Act, the 3rd act on that list, created a new customs board for the North American colonies to be based right here in Boston, with branch offices, I don't know if anyone called them that, but offices in other ports. Historically, enforcement of the British trade laws in Britain had regulated the colony's trade since the 1650s, over 100 years at this point. But enforcement of those laws had historically been the responsibility of the Customs Board in London, but London was so distant that enforcement was notoriously lax. The colonists had mastered the art of saying they accepted a law without, in fact, very often obeying it. So the Commissioners of Customs Act was designed to put some teeth into these new measures. In 1768, Parliament strengthened the enforcement further by creating 3 new Vice Admiralty courts, one in Boston, one in Philadelphia, and one in Charleston, with Crown-appointed judges who would hear smuggling cases without a jury. And finally, the New York Restraining Act, kind of its own thing, but it doesn't make it any more popular. It punished the city of New York for refusing to comply with the Quartering Act of 1765. It barred the New York Assembly from passing any new legislation until they agreed to pay for and provide housing for several hundred British regulars stationed in the city. Together, the Townsend Acts violated at least 4 cardinal principles of the English Constitution, and you probably could add a couple more to this list. First, they violated the fundamental English right of no taxation without representation. Second, they violated the right of each colonial legislature to decide whether or not to fund the executive and judicial branches. Very important check on the power of the governor and the judiciary is that the legislature control the purse strings. Third, they violated the sanctity of property. That's a big one. And fourth, they violated the right of the accused to be tried by a jury of his or her peers. What's not to like? Well, then as now, Americans have wondered why Parliament took a step that seemed guaranteed to inflame colonial opinion. Why indeed? Well, the answer involves the failure of the American Stamp Act of 1765, Parliament's first major attempt at colonial taxation. There actually was another act, the Sugar Act of 1764, which also was supposed to raise revenue. But the Stamp Act was the big one that got everybody worked up. Unlike the 1767 Townsend Acts, which we're talking about today, the Stamp Act was designed to help pay the post-war costs of 10,000 British regulars of the British government stationed in the North American territories that it had conquered from France and Spain during the 7 Years' War. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of the war and the subsequent decision to keep troops in America here. I can talk at length about that. I'm happy to discuss during question and answer. It's important to note that initially these troops were almost all in Indian country, that is the Trans-Appalachian West. Detroit had a big garrison, Fort Niagara, and also in Canada and Florida. They were not in the main cities, and their purpose was purely defensive. They're not here to cow the colonies into submission. Occasionally historians have made that argument, and there's oftentimes a popular sense that that's what they're there for. Not true. They're there to defend the colonies. Even though they were there ostensibly for the colony's benefit, being taxed by Parliament was not popular, to put it mildly, and the result was widespread resistance to the new taxes. The highlights included Patrick Henry's famous speech in the Virginia House of Burgesses defying George III, riots in Boston and other American ports, attempts across, particularly in ports also, to boycott British goods. We're simply not going to buy your commodities if you tax us. And the summoning of a Congress, the first time this word is used during the imperial crisis, the summoning of a Congress of colonial delegates that met in New York in October 1765. Well, in the face of this opposition, Parliament retreated. They backed down. And they repealed the Stamp Act in 1766, holding widespread hearings, a lot of thought, a lot written about this, and they decided, guess that wasn't a good idea. And a new government comes to power, and they repealed the Stamp Act. The colonists were jubilant. What no one noticed, I'm not sure anyone noticed this in America, at least the line is that nobody noticed, was that the repeal was deeply unpopular with most members of Parliament who did not like being shown up by a group of colonists and resented the American victory. To kind of mollify, throw an olive branch in the direction of those folks, the government, it's the governor, the Marquis of Rockingham, for those of you keeping score. George III had a series of different ministries in the 1760s, and this is the Marquis of Rockingham. They threw sort of an olive branch to their opponents by passing the American Declaratory Act, saying that although we're repealing this tax, we still have the right to legislate for America, quote, in all cases whatsoever, including taxation. So we're not taxing you this time, but we can tax if we want to. No. The act was based on the Irish Declaratory Act of 1720, which had given Parliament the right to legislate for the conquered Kingdom of Ireland. as well as legislative supremacy over the Irish Parliament. So there's a precedent for Parliament's doing. It's basically treating the colonies in America the same way it treated Ireland, saying, we're the boss. Well, during the hearings on the Stamp Act, Benjamin Franklin, who was in London throughout this period, he'll come up a couple times in this talk, had given testimony before Parliament against the Stamp Act, or about the Stamp Act, in which he suggested very misleadingly that the problem with the stamp tax was that it was an internal tax, as opposed to an external tax on trade. Internal, and the Stamp Act actually taxed goods deep in American territory, whereas the Townsend Acts are all their tariffs levied at the port of entry. So they're external taxes. And Franklin implied that external taxes, colonists would be happy to pay that. What Franklin meant was that the colonists accepted the Navigation Acts, which did have taxes associated with them, but they're regulatory, not revenue raising. Well, but that's not how Charles Townshend heard him. Townshend was there. And in drafting the Revenue Act of 1767, he appears to have been influenced by Franklin's testimony and hoped he could satisfy both constituencies, hardliners in Parliament who want a second, swing at the piñata of colonial taxation, and the colonists by taxing imports. He could not have been more mistaken. So, you guys already know that if you've heard any of the other lectures or your history. It didn't help also that Townsend changed the revenue's purpose at the last minute from paying the army, this army that is securing these new territories conquered from France and Spain and Indian territory, to funding the costs of civil government. Now, during the Stamp Act crisis, there had been Americans who said, look, we realize we need an army. And again, this isn't widely understood always by people, thinking about the revolution. Not everybody opposed having a British army over here. Pretty good army, it's pretty good at keeping us safe. And some even quietly conceded that a way to pay those soldiers might need to be found. Paying the costs of government was another matter. You're very hard-pressed to find anyone who said that was okay. Well, Townsend's miscalculation produced a renewed confrontation between Parliament and between Parliament's imperial authority on one hand and the rights and liberty of the people, most visibly in America, especially here in Boston. Boston really sort of became ground zero for the resistance to parliamentary authority, but with sympathetic protests in Britain and Ireland as well. In America, the resistance in some ways looked a lot like the resistance to the Stamp Act in 1765, with political pamphlets, boycotts, and in Boston's violence. Though the violence was less widespread and destructive than in 1765. That's a really interesting point. This time, however, the British government refused to back down. Sorry, guys, we're not stopping. When Bostonians harassed the new Customs Commission, set up by one of the Townsend Acts, in early 1768, the British ministry sent the 50-gun HMS Romney to Boston Harbor. They didn't actually open fire, but it's like, we mean business. On October 1st, after rioting over the seizure of John Hancock's sloop Liberty, forced the new Customs Commissioners to take refuge in Castle William in Boston Harbor. General Thomas Gage, Commander-in-Chief of all British forces in North America, began disembarking 2 regiments of foot on the government's orders with the goal of restoring order. And here we see Paul Revere's famous painted engraving of the British troops disembarking in Boston. British authorities also prosecuted Hancock in the new Vice Admiralty Court for smuggling, though Hancock's attorney, John Adams, won an acquittal. Partly because it feared disturbances in Britain and America were linked, the British government, now led by the Duke of Grafton, and again, this revolving door is actually part of the problem. George III keeps bringing in new ministers, and each one has his own great idea about how to fix things, so there's not a lot of consistency here. Anyway, now the Duke of Grafton is in charge, and Grafton also cracked down on popular protest in England and determined to make an example of John Wilkes by ordering his arrest, and eventually arranged to have him expelled from the House of Commons after his election to Parliament. That drama actually happened in 1769, but Wilkes was twice expelled by the House of Commons because of his libel. He also published kind of a pornographic attack on the Church of England. This didn't win him a lot of friends in high places. And so the Commons twice expelled him, and each time the electors of Middlesex County, which is a big urban county that includes London and Westminster, re-elected him. They said, sorry, this is our guy. So Wilkes becomes part of a standoff over between Parliament and the people in Britain. During the early stages of this, in May of 1768, a protest in St. George's Field, London, across from the jail where Wilkes was being held, got out of hand. British soldiers arrived, read the crowd the riot act. The crowd refused to disperse, and the troops opened fire, killing half a dozen, including a young boy named William Allen. And William Allen becomes a particular figure. Allegedly, the soldier chased him into a barn and murdered him there. So Allen was not killed in they didn't kill him in self-defense. So there's a crackdown in Britain, and the government also dispatched Townsend's older brother, George Viscount Townsend, or Lord Townsend, as he's often called, to Ireland as the kingdom's Lord Lieutenant, essentially the royal viceroy, the governor of Ireland, where he worked to persuade the Irish Parliament, and Ireland had its own parliament, kind of like a colonial legislature, though it's a parliament, where he worked to persuade the Irish Parliament to increase the size of the kingdom's standing army from 12,000 to 15,000 soldiers. Those reforms triggered a new patriot opposition movement in the Irish House of Commons and among the general populace. Okay, so that's the overview of what happened. A key figure in this is a man named John Dickinson. Dickinson was an attorney from Philadelphia whose letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania, we see, this is a sort of a pamphlet version of the farmers. They initially were published as newspaper letters, but later they're published as a pamphlet. His letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania, published in 1767 and 68, became a bestseller, not only in British America, but elsewhere in the British Empire, and eventually in translation across Europe. Dickinson basically was the first best-selling writer of the American Revolution. Very, very influential man. He's a gifted writer. He writes well. Now, Dickinson was a wealthy, sophisticated man who had received his education from the Inns of Court at London. So, he's American, but, he's transatlantic. He's comfortable in fairly sophisticated circles. His claim to be a simple farmer from Pennsylvania was a clever posture. Influenced, it has been suggested, by the writings of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Simplicity is really in the 1760s. And if you read the opening lines, actually you can see it. I am a farmer. He sets himself up as just this, we're living in a log cabin, drinking out of a wooden gourd. But the posture worked. The letters were reprinted widely throughout the British Atlantic, as well as in translation across Europe, as I've said. Okay, Dickinson's central argument, the central argument of the pamphlet, was that Parliament had once been the bulwark of English liberty. It had been that in the 17th century in particular, during the English Civil War of the 1640s and the Glorious Revolution of 1688 and 89, when it had defied the tyrannical Charles I and his two sons, Charles II and James II, over their attempt to turn Britain into an absolute monarchy. And Parliament stood up. At the peak of the confrontation in 1649, Parliament had actually put, make sure this thing doesn't come off, looking at the sound man back there. Parliament had actually put Charles I on trial, convicted him as a traitor, and Charles I was famously executed. So Parliament is no friend of monarchy in the 17th century. In the 18th century, the threat of royal despotism had receded. Who wants to have their head cut off? The British monarchs had learned how to live with Parliament. But as they did, they gained a new influence over its affairs through the growth of the British state. particularly the fiscal military state, as we call it, the expansion of the Army and Navy, and the growth of the revenue service necessary to fund those institutions. And these all brought wealthy or potentially money-making positions that people were eager to have. And about 100 of those people sat in the House of Commons, and they became reliable supporters of the crown. The result was that the king, or queen for that matter, and Queen Anne was queen during this period, and Queen Victoria would be, the British monarchs, king or queen, lived with Parliament, but Parliament became much more dutiful, and they kind of worked together. We got a deal here. From a check on the royal prerogative, Parliament had become a new instrument of royal power. And for that reason, if things didn't go well, at least in the hands of a corrupt minister, a potential threat to the people whom it was supposed to represent. Now, as John Dickinson knew, British opposition leaders had been warning about the danger that the influence of the Crown in Parliament and the corruption of Parliament could pose to the liberty of the British people since the 1720s. If anyone wants to know more about that side of things, I'm happy to talk about it during the Q&A. The Stamp and Townsend Acts showed that the possibility of parliamentary tyranny was not confined to England, but had become a threat to liberty in America and the rest of the empire as well. This is a problem that's metastasizing, to use a medical term. Parliament, as its power expanded, was not just threatening liberty in Britain, but it's reaching out into the colonies in Ireland as well. Dickinson warned that if the Townsend Acts were allowed to stand, there would be no need for the colonial assemblies to continue meeting. After all, the Townsend Act is now paying governors and judges. Why would they even need to meet? And that they might fall into disuse. So that the British Constitution in the colonies would become an absolutist monarchy. It would only be Parliament, and Parliament, we've already seen, isn't doing a very good job of representing the colonists. Parliament, once a bastion of British liberty and constitutional government, according to Dickinson, had become a potential tyrant in the mode of Charles I and his sons. Well, Dickinson's ideas struck a chord everywhere. Now, he's not the only one to talk this way. I mean, if you've done much reading on the period, you know that there are lots and lots of people saying this. But Dickinson said it especially well, and he really steps forward. In Ireland, his ideas resonated with Lord Townsend's patriot opponents, who wanted to make the kingdom's parliament less dependent on the Parliament of Great Britain. In London, John Wilkes and his supporters deliberately embraced the Americans' cause, identifying their own struggle with Parliament with the colonies. But it was in America where Dickinson's letters were truly explosive. The Massachusetts House of Representatives responded with a circular letter calling on colonial legislatures up and down the continent, the eastern seaboard, to petition the British government to repeal the Revenue Act. When Lord Hillsborough, newly appointed colonial secretary in London, learned of the petition, he sent his own letter to the colonial governors throughout North America, ordering them to dissolve any legislature that complied with the Massachusetts request, and he instructed Massachusetts Governor Francis Bernard to have the House rescind its circular. The Massachusetts House refused by a vote of 92 to 17. Bernard promptly dissolved the chamber, but the gambit failed to dissuade other assemblies. With the exception of Virginia and Pennsylvania, legislatures directed their petitions to George III, not Parliament, because to petition Parliament would acknowledge its sovereignty over the colonies. You can already see this is setting up as it's a much more extreme confrontation than had been the case during the Stamp Act crisis. And here I have to give a shout out to Paul Revere, whose association is helping sponsor this lecture. Here we see Paul Revere's wonderful Liberty Bowl, which he struck it was commissioned by the Sons of Liberty, commemorating the Massachusetts House of Representatives for defying the British Crown, or the British Ministry rather, and refusing to rescind its circular letter. It's also interesting, the inscription includes the words Wilkes and Liberty, John Wilkes becomes a very big deal here in America. If you've ever driven through Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, that's named partly for John Wilkes. John Wilkes Booth, who shot Abraham Lincoln, is also named for him, but we'll leave that aside. Okay. As with the Stamp Act of 1765, the Townsend Acts American opponents did not limit their actions to legislative protests, but organized boycotts of British goods, hoping to pressure British merchants to press Parliament to repeal. Increasingly, though, they acted not on an ad hoc basis, as they often had in 1765, but in close coordination with each other. They correspond with each other, see who's doing what. In fact, I mean, the Massachusetts circular letter was started after John Dickinson sent a copy of his letters to James Otis. So there's a lot of coordination here. Still loyal to the king, these Townsend Acts opponents called themselves patriots to signal their commitment to the liberty of the people. Now, patriot itself was already in use. Again, there's a lot of sort of British influence here. The opponents of Sir Robert Walpole, sometimes thought of as the first British Prime Minister, had taken the label on in the 1720s and 30s. They called themselves patriots. Today we think of a patriot as a supporter of the government, but in the 18th century, it usually meant someone who loved his or her country, and there's some very, very important female patriots. I'd be happy to talk about them during the Q&A. Female patriotism is definitely a thing in the 18th century. So it usually meant someone who loved his or her country but opposed its government. Samuel Johnson, author of the first English dictionary, oftentimes that's how we remember him, defined patriotism as, quote, the last refuge of the scoundrel. He's actually speaking of John Wilkes, who is probably a scoundrel. And in many places, colonial patriots formed associations, often led by the Sons of Liberty, and the Sons of Liberty are very active in this. And in parts of New England and some other localities, the Daughters of Liberty, who worked to enforce the boycott. And the role of women is very interesting here. Here we actually, this got the attention of newspaper. The image on the far left is a British cartoon on the female tea boycott. I think this may be from the early 1770s, but women held public spinning bees. There are actually spinning bees here in Boston, on Boston Common, and they signed their own associations and issued public statements. And of course, one of the key tools is the boycott, the control of consumer goods. And so women had a very important role to play in that process. Well, outside Boston, there was less popular violence than in 1765, but the resistance was also more determined, organized, and radical, and suggested that some patriots were starting to think in much larger terms than simply defeating these acts. The late Pauline Maier, whose book From Resistance to Revolution is still, in my mind, the best study of the radicalization of American opinion before the Revolution, suggested that the Sons of Liberty began to function in some places as a potential alternative government, one that represented the people much better than Parliament did. The clearest indication of this, again, happened here in Massachusetts and involved the extra-legal convention of towns that Samuel Adams and the Sons of Liberty began organizing across Massachusetts in September of 1768. The reason: they knew British troops were on their way, and they hoped that they could oppose it to prevent the landing. In the event, they failed in that goal, but it ensured that the landing would be unpopular and would lack legitimacy in the people's eyes. And the convention also began to open the door just a bit to the possibility of armed resistance. We oftentimes date the origins of the Minutemen to Adams's convention. Some historians do. Well, obviously, in Britain and Ireland, the Townsend Acts did not directly target either country, either kingdom. Nonetheless, the turmoil in Boston and elsewhere became a symbol for patriots across the British Empire of dangerous tendencies that demanded a response. And it's worth noting here, another thing the Townsend Acts did, and I'm not sure if any other speakers have noted this, is they only target North America. They actually, they divide Britain's American empire, leaving the West Indies alone. They're only targeting North America. The Stamp Act had affected everybody. There actually had been anti-Stamp Act protests and riots in the West Indies in 1765. So one of the things the Townsend Acts do is to start to isolate that protest in North America. And you know, one of the questions is, why doesn't Jamaica join the revolution? It probably has the answer. It probably starts with the Townsend Act. Well, in Britain, the supporters of John Wilkes began using American arguments about, they follow what's going on here very carefully, and they begin using American arguments about no taxation without representation to argue for broadening the right to vote in England, Scotland, and Wales. And British patriots increasingly argued that the only way to prevent Parliament from becoming the tyrant against which Americans like John Dickinson warned was by broadening the franchise. And those of you, to give you a little bit of background here, the British House of Commons was an elected body. It's representative. And we estimate that maybe 25% of adult men in England could vote for its members, but representation is very, very uneven. In London and the surrounding counties, including Middlesex, which elected John Wilkes, the franchise is actually quite broad. Not just wealthy people, but artisans and workers have the right to vote. But some of the largest, most economically dynamic cities in England were not represented at all, including Leeds, Birmingham, and Manchester. These are already powerhouses of the English Industrial Revolution gaining force, not represented in Parliament. And there are other places that have representation, but it's not adequate. In Scotland, with a population of maybe 500,000, the kingdom's 45 members in Parliament are chosen by 2,000 electors. So, you know, basically the Scots are virtually represented. Well, during the Stamp Act debates, a British politician named Thomas Whately had written a pamphlet that defended Parliament's right to tax the colonies, even though it only virtually represented them, on the grounds that 75% of all men in England and 100% of all women were also virtually represented. They're subject to the same conditions. They pay taxes, they don't have a vote in Parliament. Now, for Whately, this, you know, there was no reason, it's like, well, we do this in England, there's no reason why we shouldn't impose this in America. Wilkes and his supporters turn that argument on their head, and they say, the Americans are right to object to that, and we should too. And those arguments start to take hold, and the story that I've been telling here ends up actually launching a reform tradition in Britain that would continue across the 19th century, oftentimes invoking American-style arguments of no taxation without representation. And another anniversary we're celebrating this year is the centennial of the Representation of the People Bill of 1918, by which women 29 and older got the right to vote, almost completing the process that really goes right back to 1768. Well, in Ireland, there was less drama, and the changes that started in 1768 were more subtle. As had been true since the 17th century, the kingdom was controlled by a narrow elite of Protestant landowners who were very reluctant to defy the British government, the reason being that they owed their very privileged position to British support. Ireland, of course, then as now, is a majority Catholic kingdom. About 80% of all Irish are Catholic, and they have no civil rights. They can't even own land, and they certainly don't have a vote for Parliament. And the Irish Parliament had largely gone along with its subordinate status. It had accepted reluctantly and grudgingly the Irish Declaratory Act. And the British government assumed, as they look for revenue and troops to make up for the supplies that they can't get from American taxation, they say, well, let's turn to Ireland. And so that's what Lord Townshend submits a proposal in the Irish Parliament in 1768, calling on an increase in the Irish army with the 3,000 additional soldiers coming over here to America. To everyone's surprise, the motion was narrowly defeated. It sets off the same kind of confrontation between the British government and their representatives in Ireland and Irish patriots. And again, they call themselves patriots. And they publicly sympathize with John Wilkes. They publicly call out to the Sons of Liberty in Boston. There is a sense that we're all fighting the same cause. An Irish observer observing all of this wrote in 1768, quote, "The spirit of the devil has gone over the whole British Empire, and Satan seems to be hastening his kingdom." Well, together the combination of events in America, Britain, and Ireland produced a shared sense among patriots everywhere of the importance of what they were doing. Each group acted locally, but they increasingly thought globally. And these protests are not limited to the British Empire. There's unrest in 1768 in Geneva, in New Orleans, where French colonists rebel against the Spanish who have acquired the city, and in Corsica, which becomes a real flashpoint. France invades Corsica, it takes it over. Corsica had been a republic. Britain does nothing. And you know, the conspiracy theorists have that there's actually been a secret pact between George III and the French monarch where they've agreed that Britain won't interfere in what's going on in Corsica if France agrees to stay out of the problems of America. Obviously, if there was an agreement, France didn't live up to its side of the bargain. But there's a sense that things are falling apart. And there's a widespread sense that they just might tip over into armed insurrection. Benjamin Franklin, who was in London in 1768, seeing the Wilkes protests, seeing what's going on in America, the events in Ireland, the furor over Corsica, he thought that the entire British Empire was teetering on the brink of revolution. Well, as anyone who knows their history will know, that's not exactly what happened. In America, the revolution eventually arrived, but not for another 7 years and not without another Boston crisis, this time over tea. In Ireland, the first formal push for independence waited until the final years of the American Revolutionary War. See Irish volunteers here on the right. And then it only involved independence from Parliament, not the British king. And in Britain, well, the British famously had already had their revolution in 1688. Why did they need another? When change did come to Britain, it was not the people, but Parliament that began the process of democratizing itself, starting with the Great Reform Bill of 1832, which gave the vote to middle-class men. Wherever one looked, instead of leading to rebellion and revolution, the patriot protests of 1768 seemed to fizzle out. In Britain, George III turned the reins of government over to the conservative but supremely pragmatic Lord North in 1770. North proceeded to repeal most of Townsend's duties, except for the tax on tea, while vowing to hold the line against the more subversive acts of resistance. You could almost call Lord North the Nixon of Hanoverian Britain, going back to my 1968 analogy, but North was a famously genial figure whom even his opponents found charming and pleasant to be around. I don't think anyone ever said that about Richard Nixon. John Wilkes was eventually allowed to take his seat in the House of Commons, where he continued to speak up for the colonies, but thought better of joining them in their march toward armed resistance. Meanwhile, Ireland appeared to fall back into line. Yet, the appearance of normalcy was deceptive. For the patriots who had led the fight against Parliament, it was possible after 1768, in a way that it hadn't been even a year before, to imagine that, in the event of another round of conflict, the resolution might not be so peaceful. In that sense, the patriot moment of 1768 did indeed turn out to be a prelude to revolution, and a shattering prelude at that. Thank you.
Is there much communication between the groups, for example, in Ireland and here in the United States, as to what they were doing on a contemporaneous basis?
Yes, there was. Actually, I know more about the communication in during the peace treaty, which is what I'm writing my current book about. But yes, there's a lot of back and forth, and In fact, during the Revolutionary War, starting really in the late 1770s, Ireland and America become tangled up in each other, and Britain does too, over the question of what it means to be independent. The Irish defined independence, they actually used the term that independence means independence from Parliament, but still subject to the Crown in a kind of Commonwealth status. And there are a lot of people who say, well, that should work for America too. And so there's a lot of back and forth and mutual misunderstanding. So yeah, in that regard, they're very closely connected. But you already see, yeah, I mean, well, and Franklin actually goes to Ireland. And what he sees, Franklin, you know, he's not a founding father, he's a founding grandfather. He's the oldest of the signers of the Declaration of Independence by a long shot. And he also was probably the most loyal to the British Empire. But with Franklin's gradual disenchantment, his trip to Ireland certainly plays a role in that, because he saw the degradation that this, you know, heavy subordination on the British Parliament had produced. At least he blamed a lot of it on that.
If you were to look at the history in more rural parts of New England, you always hear the story of the white pines that were marked with King George's arrow.
Yeah.
Does this play into any of your research?
Well, I'm from New Hampshire, and from the Great Bay Estuary, and we have mast roads all over. And so the question is about I believe is about the pines, the king's pines, that actually Britain had long reserved under the Vice Admiralty jurisdiction. The Admiralty claimed the right to mark the best, straightest and tallest white pines as masts for the Royal Navy. And again, you know, these long drawn out struggles I mean, up in New Hampshire where I'm from, the Gilman family basically cut their teeth you know, fighting against that. So in terms, you know, one of the things that really matters about that is that it guarantees that this struggle over maritime rights, which is really what you know, the Customs Board is, and smuggling, isn't just, it goes well beyond the waterfront. And so these admiralty courts have jurisdiction that reaches fairly deep inland. And again, I think that the British thought, well, we could, you know, if we just target the ports, and particularly if we just target smugglers, and there's a long history of cracking down on smugglers in Britain, and it hadn't caused revolution. But I think there was a sense that this wouldn't extend inland, but certainly with things like that, yes, it does reach in there, and that's part of the calculus.
It's interesting when you mentioned about Ireland saying being independent, free from the Parliament, and then the colonies. It's like when Jefferson wrote the Declaration, it was free from the monarchy.
Yes.
So when did this, you know, this period, when did that take place?
Okay, that's a great question. Your question is about when do Americans move from wanting to be independent of Parliament to wanting to be independent of the monarchy? That's a great question, and in fact, I mean, just because, you know, I actually think, I get off on this stuff, but not everybody does. You would have left if I'd started talking about Commonwealth theory of empire. In 1768 and 67, and 69 rather, and Dickinson gets caught up in this himself, you start to see colonists saying that we no longer accept Parliament's jurisdiction over us. During the Stamp Act crisis, they hadn't said that. But they say, we are not subject to Parliament, we are only subject to the king. And Virginia, which of course calls itself the Old Dominion, could actually make a case that Parliament had not been involved in its founding. And you hear some of that up here surrounding in Massachusetts. It's hard, if you're from Georgia, it's kind of hard to argue because Georgia is founded in the 1730s and very, very much by act of Parliament. But So there's, there's like, but the first step toward full independence starts with this defiance of Parliament, but saying we still accept the authority of the king. And that that doesn't really disappear until the Declaration. So George Washington, he's up here in charge of the soldiers in Boston. He's writing letters saying, I am the king's most loyal subject. And the troops I'm fighting against are a ministerial army, which is, again, it's, these are corrupt men who have sort of taken over the king's government, but I really understand what it means to be a loyal British subject. And so that does live on. The other place where it lives on is with loyalists. And because loyalists actually are not big fans of Parliament either. And so there's a loyalist political theory that emerges, and a lot of loyalists they're loyal to the king, but they're not sure about Parliament. And you see this in Vermont, for example, where the Allens, eventually they decide to join the United States, but Vermont they've actually got a set of colonial papers in the colonial office about Vermont. And they're thinking, well, we'll be under the king, but we'll still govern ourselves, we won't worry about Parliament.
Oh, I'm from the old country, in fact we are. Townsend, I hadn't heard his name before. Was he a minister or just an MP trying to make a name for himself?
The Townsends are from Norfolk. They are, in fact, they're an interesting group. They're from, again, I could drive everybody out of here holding forth at length about some of this interesting things about the Townsends, but they're from an old Norfolk gentry family. I mean, they're long-standing, and Sir Robert Walpole was also from Norfolk, so they're sort of part of that Walpolean oligarchy. It's a sort of then they're intermarry with each other. So but they had themselves been patriots. During the sort of the mid-18th century. William Pitt, who was prime minister during the 7 Years' War, was the patriot minister. A brief moment when the patriots are in power. And George Townsend, he's a military officer, but he also is a big supporter of the militia, which is a big cause in England. And of course, the right to bear arms is big over here too. And during the 7 Years' War, they reformed the militia, and Townsend writes a Norfolk militia drill manual that becomes the how-to. He greatly simplifies the Army's drill, and that becomes sort of the manual used by militias in America and Ireland. It's kind of funny. I mean, these guys are in government, but their actions are actually, they've also done things that help to spread the word among, this other side of patriotism. So, but yeah, the Townsends are a big. They're a big deal.
It's interesting you were talking about how the Stamp Act is affecting other British colonies, like in the Indies.
Yeah.
So, when the next thing doesn't affect everybody except for North America, does it also affect British Canada? So why do they stay and not go with us?
That's a good question. I'm going to bet that if you're in Nova Scotia, which is the largest settlement at this point, you're expected to pay those taxes. Nova Scotia is an interesting place. These famous parlor games, why is Jamaica not the 14th state? Why is Nova Scotia not the 14th state? In the case of Nova Scotia, it has to do with a couple things. First off, it's very vulnerable to the Royal Navy. Nova Scotia stays loyal for the same reason that most of Maine stays loyal. Shh, don't tell anybody. But, Maine is loyalist territory throughout the Revolution. Just because the Navy in particular is such a big presence up there. So, the real protests, places like Boston or New York or Philadelphia or Charleston, these have a dense population, and, even 2 regiments. There's, you know, and these soldiers who come into Boston are the same soldiers that get caught up in the disaster of the Boston Massacre. It's not a happy story, and they don't restore order. Instead, they create chaos because they're out of their element. In Nova Scotia, you know, the king's officers can get a lot more of what they want. It's not a huge, so I believe Nova Scotia is subject to that, though I don't quote, well, actually, I guess I'm on tape, but don't tell anybody.
So you spoke briefly on different politicians' approach to enfranchising the colonists a little more.
Mm-hmm.
Is there one theory on that gains a little more traction? Is it a similar style to enfranchisement in England? Is it, you know, would each colony have had the ability to make their own laws for that? How would that have played out in the most dominant style?
You're talking about the right to vote. Yes, that's a great question. So it, as actually would continue to be the case until our own Representation of the People Bill, when women gained the right to vote finally in the United States. The states had their own standards of, you know, the first state to give women the right to vote actually is New Jersey during the Revolution, but then Nevada after the Civil War, long before women gain it nationally. So there's a great deal of unevenness in the United States, and that's a legacy of the colonial era, so that it varied widely. Here, and it also varied provincial versus town. So just to use Massachusetts as the example, the New England towns tended to be democratic in a kind of democratic. You want everybody to buy in. So they try to keep the franchise as broad as possible. That way, if you're at a town meeting where it's agreed to do this and you decide you don't like it, you were still at that town meeting and you voted for it. So it actually becomes sort of a way of forcing people to agree with things they don't like. In provincial elections here in Massachusetts, it tends to be a narrower franchise, but land is so much more widely available. In all these places, the right to vote depends upon owning a certain amount of land. So the figures I've heard are about 50% of adult men could vote in most colonies. So the franchise is broader. And this is pointed out that in Britain, they say, you know, these places are democratic already. And it starts to drive the thinking about things like the Townsend Acts, which are partly about taking power out of the hands of these democratic legislatures, as the British see it.